Okay, in this session, I want to show you a video clip of a famous impromptu interview in journalism in Canada. And when you watch this interview, I want you to ask yourself, could you do this interview? If you had the opportunity to do an important interview without warning, could you do it? Could you do an interview right now? Suppose I suddenly introduce an interview subject in one of these sessions. Would you be able to interview that person? When is an opportunity for an interview at an opportunity? Would you recognize an opportunity for an interview, or would you be blind to it? Would you let that opportunity slip away and you never realize there was an opportunity? Is there an opportunity right now in your circumstances that you don't see? Do you begin in journalism with a newsworthy source, or do you begin with a newsworthy topic? Which is more important? The who, the source in the interview, or the what? Well, a provisional answer would be it depends. Every story in journalism can be different with different problems to solve. And in part, in journalism, you are a problem solver. So think of Marie Colvin. You're reading her biography. And in the section you've read so far, the first 6 chapters, how did Colvin get the opportunity to interview controversial world leaders like Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi in 1986 and PLO leader Yasser Arafat in 1987? How did Marie Colvin get that opportunity when other journalists couldn't get it? The biography of Colvin says that Colvin's interview with Gaddafi in 1986 was a career-making move for her. What created that opportunity? Was it sheer luck, or was it something else? One of Colvin's idols as a journalist was the Italian interviewer Oriana Fallaci. And Oriana Fallaci had interviewed Gaddafi in 1979, and that interview is available in a collection of interviews of Fallaci published in 2011 called Interviews with History and Conversations with Power. And in this course, I'm going to refer to Oriana Fallaci because during her time, she was an exceptional journalist whose career was tied to doing interviews. And we can learn some things about interviewing from Oriana Fallaci and from other journalists who are good interviewers and other people who are not journalists but are also good interviewers. Anyway, back to Marie Colvin. Marie Colvin got a personal interview with Gaddafi in 1986. And look at the time frame of this. Colvin is moving up in her career very quickly. In 1981, she gets a job with UPI, United Press International. In 1985, 4 years later, Colvin is promoted to Paris bureau chief of UPI. And that's a fast ascent. Then in 1986, Colvin turns 30. She interviews Gaddafi. And that same year, 1986, Colvin starts to work with the Sunday Times, which becomes a stable platform for her. And she continues the rest of her career. So how on earth did Colvin do that? How did she rise so quickly in journalism? How did she get that career-making interview with Gaddafi. Marie Colvin wrote an account of that, and which is published in 2011, and I've posted that online for you on Moodle if you're interested in reading that. And the Colvin biography gives information on that interview. So when is an opportunity for an interview an opportunity? What creates that opportunity? Well, the biography tells us that Judith Miller of the New York Times had been trying for 3 months to get an interview with Gaddafi because it was a historical moment. It was a controversial moment, and the media wanted that interview with Gaddafi. At that time, it was well known that Gaddafi was attracted sexually to female journalists. And as you read the account in the biography of Colvin, you get the clear indications of that. So what happened? What does the text tell us? What does the book tell us? Well, Miller gave Colvin the contact phone numbers for those close to Gaddafi, and that was a key factor in Colvin getting the interview with Gaddafi, that career-making moment. So why on earth would Judith Miller, technically a journalist competing with other journalists like Colvin, why would Judith Miller give Colvin the contact numbers? It worked for competing newspapers. The biography gives the answer to that question on page 70. Colvin and Miller met in Paris, and there was an immediate bond between the two of them. They both showed up at the same news events, the same diplomatic events, the same parties. Colvin going to those events was part of the zest for life that Colvin had. Colvin challenged you, and you admired and trusted her. Colvin and Miller hosted parties together in Paris. They wanted to do a holiday together in France. They wanted to drive around the French countryside together. So the two of them contrived a feature story about truffle season in France so that they could get a paid holiday to be together and tour around the French countryside. So Colvin had earned the trust and admiration of Miller, who's a seasoned journalist, probably with a degree of skepticism and wariness that comes with journalists. But Colvin earned the trust and admiration of Miller. And because Colvin was able to earn the trust and admiration of Miller, Miller gave Colvin the contact numbers that made Colvin's career. In the same way, Colvin was able to earn the trust and admiration of others, of sources, and to build a network that way. And with Miller, it wasn't that Colvin was manipulative. It wasn't that she was planning. It was mutual trust and admiration. It was the character of Colvin. You can't fake that character. It is who you are. So the Gaddafi interview made the career of Colvin. It gave her repeated access to Gaddafi, as you'll see as you continue to read the biography, and it probably motivated other world leaders to agree to an interview with Colvin, in the same way that the success of Oriana Fallaci in gaining access to world leaders built a momentum for the career of Fallaci. Important people like to be interviewed by journalists who have interviewed other important people. It builds momentum. Important people see that you've done interviews with other leading figures, that those interviews have become prominent, and so they want to be interviewed by you. So the opportunity to interview Gaddafi came unexpectedly from Marie Colvin. Marie Colvin did not plan it. It was not fate or inevitability, but it also happened as a sequence of unconnected events. Afterwards, we can look back with what's called, can you mute your mic, please? I need to plug in here. Okay. It wasn't fate or inevitability that Colvin got the interview. It was a sequence of unconnected events, what's labeled as hindsight bias. That is, after something has happened, we look back at the sequence of events and we believe that we see a chain of events that is inevitable, but it's not. You just don't experience life that way. And so what we're probably seeing in this career-making move of Colvin is an unplanned sequence of events. And all these events are the sort of things that a journalist would do. But others don't always understand this about journalism, and it's something you need to think about and you need to grapple with. So, for example, in universities have a strange idea about research and opportunity that does not fit journalism. So years ago, when I wanted to produce journalism while I was teaching here at this university, I had to get approval in advance to interview sources. I intended to write a book about orangutans in Southeast Asia as an endangered species. That meant interviewing scientists, conservationists, zookeepers, government officials, and ordinary people who had unusual stories to tell. Academics believe that research can be planned in advance, and that you can plan in advance everyone you will interview. And then the university process at this time was to get committee approval months in advance before you interview people. But that's not how journalism works. That's not how interviewing works. That's not how building a story works in journalism. University committees don't understand that. And when I tried to explain to them how journalism worked, it probably sounded like I was explaining a haphazard, unprofessional approach. As, for example, we look back and say, how did Marie Colvin get that career-making interview with Gaddafi? And how are you going to do the assignment in this course that requires you to do interviews and find interview subjects? How does that happen? How do you do that? This in an academic context, a hyper-rational context of universities, it's hard for academics to understand that. Now, it's true that in journalism, you plan some interviews in advance, but other interviews happen because you have positioned yourself for an unexpected opportunity. You put yourself in places and situations where there are opportunities, and you let those things play out. So, for example, in my own career as a newspaper reporter, I wanted to write a story about the lives of Canadian sailors on a submarine. I did pre-interviews by interviewing a few submariners in advance on land, but those interviews were intended to prepare for other interviews. I knew that the best story was the setting being on board a submarine while it was sailing, and I knew the best opportunities for interviews would be in that setting. I didn't know in advance who would consent to an interview and who would have the best stories, but I knew that the best opportunities would be on board the submarine. Then I could witness and describe the action personally, and the submariners would be more likely to talk to me if they were locked up on a submarine. It was setting. It was getting access to the setting where the opportunities would happen. So I got, to get that opportunity, I went to the bureaucracy and got permission from the Department of National Defense. There was no guarantee in that permission that anybody would talk to me. No one would be forced to talk to me, and that's an important theme I'm going to examine. Nobody is forced to talk to you as a journalist. You do not have any power to compel somebody to talk to you, particularly if it's against their interests to talk to you. So nobody getting permission from the Department of National Defense didn't mean that anybody would talk to me. But I prepared for conversations by reading books about submarines and by doing pre-interviews with submariners on land, so that when I did interviews on the submarine, I could refer to knowledge that I already had from the pre-interviews. Now, I talk in this course about news angles, news values. What's the news angle? What was the news angle for this story? Well, the news angle at the time was the Canadian government wanted to justify replacing Canada's old diesel-electric submarines with nuclear-powered submarines. And the idea was that Canada has a huge ocean coastline, part of it in the Arctic, and Canada needs to be able to control that coastline. In the Arctic, because of the ice, the only practical way to control the coastline is with submarines that can go under the ice. And of course, this is actually an issue that's going to increase in Canada with global climate change and melting of the ice in the Arctic, because the melting of the ice is opening up sea lanes around Canada's northern coast, and then there's going to be a question of how does Canada maintain security and its coast. Anyway, at the time, in the 1990s, the Canadian government wanted to replace Canada's old diesel-electric submarines with nuclear-powered submarines that could go under the ice for stronger. Now, if the Navy let a journalist ride on one of these submarines and publish a story, it would be an opportunity to sell the idea to Canadian voters. So this is what the Department of National Defense wanted. They were perfectly willing to agree to my request because it was in their advantage. And the story was published in eventually published in a newspaper magazine, and then republished in Reader's Digest. So the Department of National Defense, the submarine navy of Canada, got good exposures. As far as I know, I was the only journalist to do that story at the time from inside a submarine. Whether I don't know whether you know, but Canada never bought nuclear-powered submarines, and its diesel-electric submarines are getting pretty old. So you understand three factors in this story. One is the story has news value. There is an opportunity for interviews, and there is a great setting. And it was the same when I was a prison reporter. I wanted to gain access inside prisons, like inside a submarine, to be able to describe the setting and to be able to create opportunities for interviews. And you see the same thing, Marie Colvin doing the same thing. She's not doing the interview with Gaddafi by satellite phone. She's going to the location. She's going to the scenes of conflict where there is a setting that she will be able to witness, and where she will have the opportunity for interviews. So, for example, as you get in some of the incidents in the biography, you'll see that Colvin goes into Syria, for example, at the end of the book, and she goes to a hospital because she realizes that a hospital is a setting that creates an opportunity for interviews. That is, where are you going to find a lot of victims in a conflict zone to interview? You're going to find them in a hospital. So the opportunity for interviews is going to be in the hospital. Plus, you got doctors and nurses, other people to interview. In the biography, you learn that one of Colvin's idols as a journalist was Martha Gellhorn from a generation before. Martha Gellhorn did the same thing. Martha Gellhorn went to hospitals, partly because for the same reason. There are victims in hospitals. You don't have to go out wandering the street looking for victims. All the victims are going to the hospital. So there's the opportunity for interviewing, and you have doctors as well, professionals that you can interview. That's one of the reasons why Gellhorn did it. Another reason she did that is because of the segregation of journalists at the time. During World War II, Western countries and Western militaries would only give male journalists access to the conflict zones. So female journalists were sidelined, and in a sense, they were segregated. Martha Gellhorn broke barriers by finding ways to circumvent that kind of segregation. So for the D-Day landing in Normandy at the end of World War II, Martha Gellhorn's husband, Ernest Hemingway, went through the bureaucracy and got limited access to the conflict zone. Martha Gellhorn, who's not allowed the access of her husband, Ernest Hemingway, hid in the washroom of a hospital ship going to the D-Day landing so that she could get at the D-Day landing. And she actually landed with the hospital people and carried stretchers and that sort of thing. So in the end, Martha Gellhorn was able to scoop Ernest Hemingway, even though he theoretically had an advantage that she didn't have, that Gellhorn didn't have as a female correspondent. Okay, so setting. Setting is opportunity for subjects to interview, and setting is something to describe. One time in one of my journalism courses, I had an idea for a student to write a story. And the idea came from 6 paragraphs of a court story in the Camrose Daily News, which is now defunct. And the six paragraph story said that a judge had sentenced a man to 6 weeks in prison for ordering a hamburger in Kamloops that he couldn't pay for. Imagine that. 6 weeks for a hamburger worth a few dollars. How fair is that? How fair is the justice system? Why did this happen? Well, I went into class one day and I offered this story idea to anybody in class who wanted to do it as an assignment. Only one student in the class was willing to take that challenge. It was a female student, and she said, I'll do it. Now, there's larger dimensions to the stories that unfolded, and in a later session, I may get into the larger dimensions of the story. Anyway, after the student finished the story, I contacted the editor that I knew in a national magazine where I published, and he published the student's story. So here is a journalism student getting doing a journalism news story and getting it published in a national magazine while she's still in journalism school, before she's even graduated. Anyway, the part of the story that I'm getting to, and I'll eventually get to, is the setting. And I'm talking about opportunity and setting now. So the student started to work on the story, and she told me that the man had been sentenced, would be out of prison in several weeks. So she needed more time to wait and interview him. And I told her, no, do the interview right away. Do the interview in prison so that you can describe the details of this man incarcerated. You can describe what he looks like, the prison garb he's wearing. You can describe the setting of the prison so that the setting will help bring the interview and the story alive. Now, I know about access to prison since I was a prison reporter for years, and at this time, I was also, while working here at the university, I was also chair of the Citizens Advisory Board for the Kamloops Maximum Security Prison, where this man was serving time. So the student did that, and I explained how she would get access to the interview, and it's fairly easy. Okay, so she did the interview. The student interviewed the man's defense attorney. That's an obvious one. In Canada, you typically don't try to interview judges, because judges in Canada typically don't consent to media interviews for cases they have tried. In the United States, U.S. judges are more likely to do it. In Canada, judges are unlikely to do an interview of a case they've tried, particularly an interview with a university student. But, I said to the student, you should try. The worst thing that's going to happen is the judge is going to say no. But I also thought, maybe this judge feels uneasy about the position that the case put him in. So the judge is unlikely to consent to the interview, but why not try? So what happens? Guess what happens? Okay, you guessed it, right? The judge phones the student on her cell phone. In fact, when the judge phones, the student is driving, so she has to pull her car over to the side of the road, and she did the interview from her cell phone. And a sidebar to that is always have a notebook and pen with you. Imagine if the judge had phoned and the student didn't have a notebook and pen with her. She might lose the whole interview because of that. So the end result is this. The local newspaper published a 6-paragraph story and didn't see any potential story beyond that. The local newspaper did not follow the story. A journalism student had an opportunity, published a bigger story, published a story in a national magazine. 3 things. News values. The story had really strong news values. I can explain that at another time. Opportunity and setting. So I was also explaining how it takes a bit of effort to wrap your head around how journalism interviews take place. And like I said, when I came here to teach and continue to produce journalism, universities committees didn't understand what makes journalism work or what makes a journalism interview work. Yes, you plan and prepare, but you also rely on unexpected opportunities. You create unexpected opportunities for yourself. And it took a while for me to break down the resistance of university committees to the idea that interviewing in journalism is done a different way. And at the time, I wanted to write a book, which I eventually finished, about orangutans as an endangered species. I knew that for setting an opportunity, I wanted to be in the jungles of Southeast Asia with orangutans and scientists, because then I could describe what was happening myself. And because there would be unexpected opportunities with orangutans and scientists and zookeepers, like the submarine, like prisons, I got access to the settings inside zoos, inside sanctuaries where the public is not allowed, and I was in jungles where few people don't go. I also did research. For one thing, I collected old, out-of-date, out-of-print books that most scientists wouldn't be interested in. I was looking for the history and biography that scientists don't typically study. And from that, I found a 1974 out-of-print book by John McKinnon, the first primatologist to do real field research on orangutans. And I found a 1968 out-of-print book by Barbara Harrison, who was a German woman who was the wife of a British diplomat in Sarawak, Borneo, who was the first person to attempt rehabilitation of orphaned orangutans. By the first decade of the 21st century, when I'm starting to work on this book, these two people were forgotten by scientists, and their books were out of print, weren't even available as ebooks. But these people were pioneers, and these out-of-print books had fascinating and forgotten details. And so I acquired copies of these out-of-print books. John McKinnon was hard to track down, but I eventually found him nowhere near orangutans. I found him working at a university in the Philippines on the main island of Luzon. And I interviewed him there. In fact, I interviewed, and I still remember that today, I interviewed John McKinnon on a day when he was tracking a black rat the size of a cat. I'm not kidding. The rat was literally this big as a cat. And the rat was loose in the ceilings of the university. John McKinnon, as a naturalist, as a biologist, as a primatologist, he didn't want to kill this enormous rat. So they trapped the rat, and McKinnon went, and I went with him to release the rat in the jungle. It was a really big rat. Barbara Harrison I couldn't find. I didn't even know she were alive. At that time, if Barbara Harrison were alive, she would be in her 80s at that time. And anyway, I made a trip to the Netherlands to interview the Dutch scientist Herman Rijkson, who did early groundbreaking work on orangutans. And I also went to the Netherlands to visit zookeepers in the Netherlands who had established amazing rapport with orangutans, so that I could interview them in that setting. I could describe the setting. And I remember that I interviewed Rijkson in his home out in the countryside in the Netherlands, we were as the interview was winding down, we were chatting, and I said to Rijkson, I'd always wanted to interview Barbara Harrison, although I had no idea where she was. Well, Rijkson said, well, she lives here in the Netherlands. She lives in a small village about 100 kilometers away. Would you like me to phone her and set up an interview? Oh, of course I would. Of course I would. And I did the interview. Harrison had great stories, stories that she'd never told anybody else. She was in her 80s at that time. Stories that inside stories, personal stories that she hadn't told anybody else, that hadn't been published. And yesterday, as I was thinking about talking about this, I went online and I checked Wikipedia, which is always a fairly good place to start. And there was a biography of Harrison, and they had no personal stories. The personal stories are in my book, and they really had they had no personal stories about this incredible woman and her incredible experiences with orangutans. She died in 2015, and she was 93 years of age. Wow. I still remember that interview, and it was an incredible experience doing that. Opportunity, chance, unexpected events, but you still create the opportunity. I knew that there was a person like Barbara Harrison, although she'd been largely forgotten at that point in time. So, if you had an unexpected opportunity to do an interview, would you recognize the interview, and could you do the interview? For example, could you interview Leslie Martin, or could you interview the lawyer for Omar Khadr, or could you interview Mahar Arar? To do those interviews, you would have to know of the opportunity, and you would have to get access. You would also have to know who Leslie Martin is. You would have to know who Omar Khadr is, and why the lawyer for Omar Khadr is a person worth interviewing. You would have to know who Mahar Arar is. Those three names are highly newsworthy, and those three names are connected to three big news stories. And I wonder if I polled the class, how many people in the class would know who Leslie Martin is, who Omar Khadr is, who Mahar Arar is. Well, all those three have been on the campus at Thompson Rivers University at one time, and were accessible to interview. Two of those people, the lawyer for Omar Khadr and Mahar Arar, were brought to speak on campus because of political science professor Derek Cook. Derek Cook has an uncanny ability to bring great speakers to campus, and he creates great opportunities, and he has a great network. So you ask yourself, who are the best guides to sources? How do you find sources? Who are the best guides? Who are the people you need to know to get access to the people you need to interview? Even if you're looking at a setting like campus of Thompson Rivers University, where we're off campus right now, but who on campus is a good guide to sources? I would say Derek Cook is. You cultivate, as a journalist, you cultivate a network. You cultivate the kind of people who can give you access to who you need to interview. And that's what happened with Marie Colvin and the interview with Gaddafi. Judith Miller, technically a competitor, gave Colvin the phone numbers of people who were close to Gaddafi, and Miller made contact with those people using the phone numbers that Judith Miller provided, and that was her big career making move. So, how are you as a journalist? If you're interested in pursuing a career in journalism, and I surveyed this class, and about 3/4 of you in this class are interested in a career in journalism. About 1/4 of you are not. That's fair enough. It's still, even if you're not interested in a career in journalism, the skills of journalism are important life skills, important career skills, and you can easily adapt them to other goals that you have in life. But considering journalism, how do you create opportunities to do interviews? How are you networking? You have in this course an assignment where you need to do interviews. And so the process I'm describing now is a process in the assignment. That is, in order to do the assignment, you have to create opportunities for yourself to do interviews. And the technology we have now, and we're on Zoom right now, Zoom is a great tool for interviewing people because you can interact with people, you can see their faces, you can do reading of a body language, you can get their sense of their tone, all the things that are part of doing an interview in person. As a journalist, you can do it really well with a tool like Zoom. With Zoom, you can go anywhere in the world. But to do the interview with Zoom or Skype or whatever teleconference tool you use, you have, and to do this assignment, you have to create the opportunity for yourself, and you have to figure out who would be the best sources, and you have to get access to those sources and plan the interview. So again, back to the question I started with: what is an opportunity in journalism? What's an opportunity to do an interview in journalism? How do you create these opportunities? If you were in the waiting room of an airport and Jeff Bezos sits down beside you, or Bonnie Henry sits down beside you, would you know who they are? And would you interview them? For an opportunity like that, you have to know who the newsmakers are and what news issues a person could talk about. And so, you need to be, if you're interested in a career in journalism, you need to be watching the news because that will tell you what's current. Sometimes you find out what you need to know just by chatting with people. So somebody sits down beside you in the airport, you start chatting with them, and you find out the person is Jeff Bezos, and then you launch in a conversation. So I began the session saying that I was going to play a historic interview in Canada. This is an impromptu scrum with Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who was the father of the current Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau. This is an interview in 1970. It's in black and white. Imagine yourself in this situation. You are a journalist hanging around the entranceway to the Parliament building in Ottawa because, as a journalist, every important federal politician has to go in and out through these doors. That's the opportunity. The politicians have to come in and out through these doors. That creates opportunity. So, so maybe one of them will linger and answer a question. So on this day in 1970, Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau is entering through the Parliament building. The background of this moment is that Pierre Trudeau was elected on a justice and equality platform, and yet historically found himself activating martial law in Canada called the War Measures Act after a Quebec separatist group had kidnapped two diplomats. In martial law, a Democrat government institutes military control of the country for a temporary period. And this gives the police and the military more power to arrest and detain people in what is a temporary partial suspension of the law. During this period in Canada, 465 people were arrested and held without charges, even though the law requires that you can't detain people without charges. The War Measures Act allows the suspension of normal law. And the fear at the time was that a militant faction was rising up against the government. Coincidentally, I'm saying this after listening to the news this morning that confirms there's been a military coup in Myanmar, and a military group has risen up against the popular elected government in that country. Anyway, in 1970, members of the Front de Libération du Québec kidnapped British diplomat James Cross, and they kidnapped Quebec provincial cabinet minister Pierre Laporte. Pierre Laporte was later murdered. So Prime Minister Trudeau instituted the War Measures Act or martial law. Now, this is a personal predicament for Pierre Trudeau because he was a lawyer who believed in civil liberty and believed in the rule of law. And so he's in the awkward position of feeling he's forced to be an autocrat and is suspending civil liberties. Imagine how that must have tormented Trudeau, how much it must have offended his sense of principles as a lawyer and a believer of the law and justice to suspend the law. So imagine this moment in time of Trudeau being questioned about it. I'm going to play the video. And in the video, it's I think 4 or 5 minutes, you're going to see the Prime Minister caught by reporters as he's entering the Parliament building. And Trudeau does not have to stop to talk to these reporters. There's nothing that compels Trudeau to talk to these reporters. But an impromptu interview takes place. And it's being recorded as well. So imagine the spectacle on TV of the Prime Minister of Canada consenting to answer questions from the media about a dilemma that's probably tearing him apart personally. What you'll see is Trudeau is very skillful in debating. Trudeau likes to debate. He's a very intellectual man, and he has confidence in his ability to debate. Certainly his ability to debate a couple of journalists. The first reporter asked the question, "Sir, was it with all these men with guns around here?" So the opening phrase is very innocuous, it's underplayed, it's non-confrontational. And Trudeau stops. And there's a discussion, and you're going to see what takes place in the discussion. Now, pay attention to how Trudeau tries to deflect the questions, how skillful he is. And imagine yourself in this situation, in this interview. What would you have done imagine you're a rookie reporter, and suddenly you end up debating with the Prime Minister of Canada about this controversial moment in unfolding history. Trudeau is very skillful. He's very skillful at deflecting the questions. He's very skillful at debating. Watch how skillful he is at turning the tables on the reporters. And what he's trying to do is to turn the tables on the reporters and expose the hypocrisy of the questions. Now, watch how the reporters withstand that. How do they stand up to the skill of the Prime Minister? And watch how the reporters chip away at Trudeau until Trudeau loses his temper and he utters a phrase famous in Canadian history. Trudeau said, and they keep goading Trudeau, you wouldn't do that. You would never do that. And Trudeau says, just watch me. In essence, just watch me. Trudeau is angry and he's showing himself and he's saying, I'm not afraid to take control of Canada with military force. That's an exceptional moment in Canadian history, and I'm going to play that for you right now.
So what is it with all these men with guns around here? Have you noticed? Yeah, I've noticed them. Why you people decided to have them? What's your worry? I'm not worried, but you seem to not worry. I know. I'm worried about living in a town that's full of people with guns running around it. Are you? Have they done anything to you? Have they pushed you around? And they pushed around friends of mine. Yeah. What were your friends doing? Trying to take pictures of them. Aha. Is that against the law? No, not at all. Doesn't it worry you having found that you've got to resort to this kind of thing? No, it doesn't worry me. I think it's natural that if people are being abducted, that they be protected against such abduction. What would you do if a Quebec minister, another Quebec minister were abducted, or a federal minister? Well, but isn't that one of the? Is your position that you should give in to the 7 demands of the FLQ and? Not at all. My position is completely opposite. What is your position? My position is that you don't give in to any of them. All right. But you don't protect yourselves against the possibility of blackmail. Well, how can you protect everybody that is going to be a possible target without a much bigger military force, without putting somebody on everybody in the country, turning it into almost a police state? So what do you suggest? That will protect nobody. How can you protect them all? Well, you can't protect them all, but are therefore arguing that you shouldn't protect any? Well, that's right. That's your position. Right. All right. So if Fiona Park wasn't protected and he was abducted, if you had hindsight, would you not have preferred to protect him and Mr. Cross? Well, it's second guessing. It's pretty easy, but you can't. Well, I'm asking you the first guess now. No, because it's impossible. It would have been impossible to protect cabinet ministers of the provincial government or diplomats? I would suspect so. With all the diplomats there are in this country, yeah, we got a big army. And they use it up pretty fast in this rate. What do you mean at this rate? 6 and 7?
Interpolate something here. You seem to be thinking this in your statement in the House this morning. You seem to be saying that you thought the press had been less than responsible in its coverage of the story so far. Could you elaborate on that?
Not less than responsible. I was suggesting that I should perhaps use a bit more restraint, which you're not doing now. You're going to make a big news item of this, I'm sure.
Well, the figures are big news item.
No, but the main thing that the FLQ is trying to gain from this is a hell of a lot of publicity for the movement.
Recognition.
And I'm suggesting that the more recognition you give to them, the greater the victory is, and I'm not interested in giving them a victory. But
surely a proposition that perhaps it would be wise to use less inflammatory terms than bandits when you talk of a bunch of people who have the lives of 2 men in their hands.
You don't think they're bandits?
Well, regardless of what I think, I don't think I'd be inclined to wave a red flag in their face if they held 2 of my friends or colleagues with guns at their heads.
Well, first of all, I didn't call them bandits. I call the people who were in jail now bandits, who've been tried before the law and condemned to a prison term. And I said that you people should stop calling them political prisoners. They're not political prisoners. They're outlaws. They're criminal prisoners. They're not political prisoners. And they're bandits. That's why they're in jail. But with your army troops, you seem to be combating them as almost as though it is a war. And if it is a war, is anything that they say have validity?
Don't be silly. We're not combating it as a war, but we're using some of the army as peace agents in order that the police be more free to do their job as policemen and not spend their time guarding your friends against some form of kidnapping.
You said earlier that you'd protect them in this way, but you have said before that this kind of violence, what you're fighting here, the kind of violence of the FLQ, can lead to a police state.
Sure. That's what they're complaining about, isn't it?
Well, yes, but surely that decision is yours, not the FLQ's.
Yeah, but I've asked you what your own logic is. It's to let them abduct anybody, not give any protection to anyone, not call out the police, and that seems to be your position.
Not call out the police. Surely the police's job is to catch people who break the law.
Yeah, but not to give protection to those citizens who might be blackmailed for one reason or another.
Which must be half the population of the country in one way or another. I explain it badly, I think, but what you're talking about, to me, is choices. And my choice is to live in a society that is free and democratic, which means that you don't have people with guns running around there.
All right,
And one of the things I have to give up for that choice is the fact that people like you may be kidnapped.
Sure.
Sir, if you had to right now,
But this isn't my choice, obviously. You know, I think it's more important to get rid of those who are committing violence against the total society and those who are trying to run the government through a parallel power by establishing their authority by kidnapping and blackmail. And I think it's our duty as a government to protect government officials and important people in our society against being used as tools in this blackmail. No, you don't agree to this, but I'm sure that, once again, with hindsight, you would have probably found it preferable if Mr. Cross and Mr. Laport had been protected from kidnapping, which they weren't, because the steps we're taking now weren't taken. But even with your hindsight, I don't see how you can deny that.
No, I still go back to the choices you have to make in the kind of society that you live in.
There's a lot of bleeding hearts around who just don't like to see people with helmets and guns. All I can say is go on and bleed, but it's more important to keep law and order in this society than to be worried about weak-kneed people who don't like the looks of a
At any cost? At any cost? How far would you go with that? How far would you extend that?
Just watch me.